The recording starts after I've already climbed into the loft. I mention that because it suggests I knew something was wrong before I admitted it to myself. I didn't go up there out of curiosity. I went up there because staying on the ground felt like a mistake. The ladder creaked under my weight, even though I'd fixed the rung the week before. When I reached the top, I lay flat against the boards and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I just knew it would be easier to see from above. Below me, the cattle were standing in the open space of the barn, not clustered in the corners, not shifting for warmth. They stood evenly spaced, bodies aligned in a way that didn't happen by accident. I could hear their breathing. At first, I thought the sound was echoing strangely. Barns do that. Sound travels in ways that don't make sense. But after a few seconds, the pattern became clear. They were breathing together. Not just at the same speed, at the same moments. Inhale, pause. Exhale, pause. I counted the breaths without realizing I was doing it. 5 cycles, 10, 20, no change. I checked my watch. The second hand moved smoothly. Everything else stayed still. That's when I noticed an extra breath. It wasn't louder, it wasn't faster, it was lower, deeper, slightly delayed. It didn't belong to any animal I owned. I remember thinking, very calmly, almost academically, why were the cows breathing like they were waiting for a signal? I stayed in the loft because the idea of being seen felt worse than the idea of falling. My name is Lucas Grayson. The farm had been in my family since before records were reliable. It didn't have a formal name. We just called it the place. That's how my father referred to it. That's how his father referred to it, as if naming it would give it more attention than it needed. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away. There were no streetlights, no paved roads close enough to hear traffic. On clear nights, the dark settled fully. There was no gradual fading. One moment there was light, the next there wasn't. During the day, the farm felt manageable, ordinary. At night, the absence of sound felt deliberate. Insects went quiet in stages. First the cicadas, then the crickets, then even the flies vanished. The barn always smelled of wet hay and rusted metal. That smell never changed. It didn't matter how often I cleaned or replaced bedding. It lingered in the boards themselves. Flies gathered on the beams during daylight, hundreds of them. When night came, they disappeared at once. I never saw them leave. I only noticed their absence. The windmill on the north side of the field turned when it wanted to. Sometimes it spun during calm air. Sometimes it stayed still during storms. I stopped tracking it after the 3rd week because it never lined up with the weather. The cattle changed after sunset. Every evening, just before the light dropped completely, they stopped grazing. Heads lifted, bodies rotated, all of them faced the same direction. Not toward the barn, not toward the road, toward the low part of the far field, near the fence, where the ground dipped slightly. The land there never grew well. Crops failed, grass stayed thin. Once they turned, they didn't move again until morning. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. Then I told myself it was habit. Then I stopped telling myself anything and just watched. Eventually, the question formed without effort. What were they looking at? The counting problem began quietly. I had stayed late repairing a latch. When I finished, I did what I had been taught to do since childhood. I counted. The total was wrong. I counted again. It changed. Sometimes there was one fewer than the logbook said there should be. Sometimes there was one more. The extra one never looked different at first glance. Same size, same color, same tag placement. But something about it felt off. Not enough to describe, just enough to notice. I remembered my father's voice then. Not raised, not urgent, just certain. Never count the animals after sunset. He never explained why. I never asked. That's how things were handled on the farm. That night I stopped counting, but the footsteps started soon after. They came from the fields, slow, even, heavy enough to feel through the ground rather than hear. They followed the fence line without crossing it. They never rushed. They never paused. By morning, there were no tracks. The cattle reacted before I heard anything, their heads lifted together, breathing aligned again. Silence settled over them like an instruction. The chickens refused to enter the coop after dark. They crowded against the fence instead. When I carried them inside, their bodies shook violently in my hands. Their heartbeats were fast and irregular. One morning, while checking the herd, I noticed a cow standing apart. It wasn't injured, it wasn't thin, it wasn't sick, but it stood differently. Too straight, too still. Its head didn't lower when I approached. The others kept distance from it. That was the moment I considered the possibility that I wasn't miscounting because of stress. I was miscounting because I was counting something that didn't belong. The ledger was beneath a warped plank in the barn floor. It wasn't hidden carefully. It didn't need to be. The pages were brittle. The ink had faded, but the handwriting remained consistent. Dates, tallies, short notes. Every entry ended the same way. One borrowed, one returned. No explanation, no variation, no indication of what had been borrowed or returned. The realization came slowly. The numbers weren't meant to match. They were meant to repeat. The farm wasn't producing livestock. It was maintaining an exchange. After that, sleep became difficult. When I did sleep, it came in short stretches. I counted without meaning to. Animals, windows, fence posts, breaths. I watched my reflection in the barn windows to make sure it moved when I did. Sometimes it felt delayed. Sometimes it felt like it was watching me back. I began to notice small things. A blink that lasted too long. A shadow that didn't shift when it should have. I remember thinking, if one of them blinked wrong, how long would it take me to accept what I was seeing? The storm came late. Wind forced the barn doors open despite the latches. Rain flattened the fields. Inside, the animals moved without sound. They parted. They created space. Something stood there. I won't describe it. Description implies understanding. I only know it stood upright, and its breathing did not match the rest. The farm was sold the following year, listed as abandoned before that. Livestock losses were blamed on predators, fencing issues, poor management. The new owners reported missing animals within weeks. They didn't stay. People still avoid the land, and on nights when the wind drops suddenly, some say they can hear breathing from the fields, measured, even, like something making sure the count stays right. I still don't know what was living on that farm, or if it ever left.
The photograph was taken at dawn. That detail matters because the light reveals things the dark can hide. In the image, the scarecrow stands at the edge of the cornfield, positioned where the rows thin out near the gravel road. Its shadow stretches across the soil, long and uneven. What draws attention is not the scarecrow itself, it's the marks around its neck. Indented impressions pressed deep into the straw, uneven, irregular, too specific to be damage caused by rope or wire. They resemble fingerprints. When I first saw the image, I asked a question that has never had an answer. How do you explain fingerprints on a scarecrow's neck? Because according to the records, that scarecrow did not exist the day before the photograph was taken. Weeks earlier, the land belonged to Martha Caldwell. She was a widowed corn farmer working 47 acres on her own. The nearest occupied house was miles away. Past the mailbox, cell service dropped out completely. If something happened after dark, help would not arrive quickly. After rainfall, the fields held a smell that lingered longer than expected. Damp soil mixed with decay, corn stalks breaking down where they stood. Martha described it as something that stayed in the air, especially near the outer rows. The first irregularities had nothing to do with scarecrows. They involved sound. Martha reported corn rustling on nights when the air was still, movement passing through the rows without a visible source. The noise traveled in lines, not randomly, as if following paths already set. Then came the crops themselves. From above, the growth formed wide circular patterns. The plants inside these shapes were taller, healthier, more uniform, too even to be explained easily. Birds seemed to notice before anyone else did. They avoided those sections completely. They perched along fence posts and power lines. They gathered at the edges of the field, but they did not land in certain rows. Martha recalled something her mother used to say, repeated without explanation. Never move what the land puts up. At the time, she had dismissed it as an old habit of speech. 3 days after the birds stopped landing, the scarecrow appeared. It was not placed in the center of the field where the old one had stood for years. It was closer to the house, positioned so it could be seen clearly from the kitchen window. Martha assumed trespassers, teenagers, someone cutting through the property. That afternoon, she dragged it back into the rows. That night, her dog refused to leave the porch. It planted its paws and pulled backward hard enough to strain the leash. When Martha tried to carry it, the animal shook violently and snapped at the air as if reacting to something she could not see. After sunset, the goats began screaming, not continuously, in short, broken sounds. Each cry ended abruptly, as if something had passed close enough to stop them. By morning, the scarecrow was back near the house, closer than before. Martha did not move it again.
Instead, she searched through what had been left behind by previous owners. Old property photos, family albums, images taken for reasons unrelated to the field itself. In several of them, the same figure appeared in the background. Different decades, different families. The same scarecrow. Always positioned within view of the house. Always dated shortly before someone went missing. That was when Martha admitted something she had avoided saying aloud. The previous owner had not moved away. After that, she boarded the windows, hammered wood into place as the light faded. While she worked, she heard breathing near the outer rows of corn, not close enough to locate, just close enough to know it was not the wind. Each evening, the scarecrow stood closer. By the 5th night, it was near the barn. Martha stopped sleeping in the bedroom. She stayed at the kitchen table instead, facing the window, counting the seconds between sounds outside. The field never went completely quiet. It paused, then continued. At one point, she asked herself a question she never answered. Would you burn it if you knew it might scream? The barn was checked just after midnight. The doors were still secured from the outside. The padlock showed no damage. No signs of forced entry were recorded. Inside, straw covered the floor in uneven drifts. Mixed into it were materials that did not belong there. Human hair, brittle fragments later identified as bone. There was no blood, no indication of a struggle. The scarecrow stood upright near the back wall. Its posture was different than before. The head angled downward, not loose, not collapsed, positioned, facing the house. Martha Coldwell left the property before sunrise. She did not notify neighbors. She did not return for personal belongings. Her vehicle was later found several miles away with the keys still inside. The farm was inspected, then closed. Soil samples were taken. Reports were written. None of the findings were released publicly. Months later, a county worker noted an unfamiliar structure at the edge of the field. It was described in the report as unidentified farm equipment. No further action was recorded. Drivers passing the property since then have reported seeing a figure standing among the rows at dusk. It is always gone by morning. Birds still avoid that section of land. The property has changed owners twice. Each transfer includes the same restriction: no activity after sunset. I don't know who placed the first scarecrow there, and I don't know why the land keeps replacing it.
I didn't hear the sound while standing on the ground. That's important. I heard it while climbing. I was halfway up the ladder when my boot slipped on a rung. I stopped, tightened my grip, and waited for my balance to come back. That's when the sound reached me. Not sudden, not loud, already in progress. A voice, long, strained, dragged out like it had been going on for a while. I stayed still, expecting it to bounce off the metal walls and come back as an echo. It didn't. The sound stopped the moment I stopped moving. And I remember thinking, very clearly, this doesn't make sense. Why was there screaming coming from a grain silo? And why did it feel like it knew I was listening? My name is Daniel Price. At the time, I was working seasonal shifts on a pig farm in the rural Midwest, the kind of job people take when they need quick money and don't plan on asking many questions. There was no paperwork beyond my name and a start date, no orientation, just a quick walkthrough of where not to step and which gates to keep closed. The farm sat miles from the nearest town, flat land in every direction, no tall trees, no cover. At night, the dark came down evenly, like a lid being placed over the land. Most days, the air smelled wrong. Not strong enough to complain about, just sour enough to notice. It clung to the back of your throat, especially near the silo. That's where the flies were. Not around the pigs, not near the feed bins, just the silo. They covered the metal walls in thick clusters, even when nothing had spilled, even when there was nothing to attract them. Another thing stood out early on. The silo stayed locked. It was harvest season. Trucks came and went. Feed arrived daily, but nothing went into that structure. The padlock stayed in place. The ladder stayed unused. The first time I asked about it, the owner said it was old equipment. The second time, he told me to focus on my work. The third time, he didn't answer the question. He gave me a rule: never go near it after dark. No explanation, no hesitation. He just repeated it until I nodded. A week later, the pigs stopped eating. They gathered at the troughs but didn't lower their heads. They stood still, ears angled toward the center of the property. At night, some of them pressed against the far fence, as if putting distance between themselves and the silo mattered. I'd worked around livestock before. Animals react to storms, to predators, to changes in routine. This wasn't that. After sunset, the sounds started again. Low voices, not clear enough to understand, rising and falling in a steady pattern, always from the same direction. I told myself it was metal reacting to temperature changes. Old structures make noise. But grain moves when it settles. It slides. It pours. It shifts. This didn't. The sound stopped when I got close. It resumed when I walked away. One night, I stood at the base of the silo longer than I meant to. The air near the metal felt warm against my face. Not leftover heat from the day, heat from inside. That's when it occurred to me that whatever was inside wasn't behaving like stored material. Later, I checked town records. The silo appeared on property maps decades before the farm was built around it. Early documents didn't list it as storage, no mention of capacity, no notes about contents. It wasn't constructed for farming. It had been repurposed. Missing person reports filled in the rest. Families who lived on that land for short periods, farmhands who never finished a season, names that appeared once and never again. No single explanation, no shared cause. The silo was always there. After that, sleep became difficult. I dreamed of falling, not fast, not endlessly, just far enough that I never reached the bottom. I woke up convinced there was dust in my mouth, even when there wasn't. During the day, I noticed shapes in the air near the silo, faces forming briefly in drifting particles, then breaking apart when I blinked. I stopped standing with my back to it. I started asking myself questions I didn't want answered. Was the farm feeding animals, or was the presence of animals part of something else? If you stayed long enough, did the place start including you? The night I opened the silo, I didn't plan to. The padlock was already loose, hanging open like no one had bothered to secure it. I climbed the ladder slowly, waiting for the sound to come back. It didn't. Inside, the silo was empty. No grain, no machinery, no residue, just heat. The air pressed against my skin in a way that felt deliberate. The walls were warm to the touch, too warm. And then, behind me, something inhaled, slow, measured, close enough that I didn't turn around. I left the job 2 days later. The fire happened shortly after. The farm burned quickly. Pens collapsed inward. Fencing gave way. By morning, nothing usable remained. The silo was untouched. No scorch marks, no heat damage, standing exactly as it had before. Investigators listed it as unrelated, cause undetermined. The land was sold. The structure remains. Drivers passing at night say the silo door sometimes gives off a faint glow. No power lines run to it. No light source has ever been identified. I don't know what the silo was used for, but I know it didn't need the farm anymore.
Stories like these rarely exist on their own. They tend to surface in similar ways, through brief reports, half-remembered warnings, and places people learn to avoid without ever agreeing on why. Over time, the details blur, but the patterns stay consistent. A structure that isn't used the way it should be. Land that changes hands too often. Rules that are passed down without explanation. If any part of these stories felt familiar, that's not unusual. Most of the accounts I collect come from people who didn't think what they experienced mattered enough to mention, until they heard someone else describe the same thing in a different place, years apart. If you noticed a detail that doesn't sit right, a sound that was dismissed too quickly, a rule that was never explained, or a moment where something should have happened but didn't, leave it in the comments. That's often where the missing pieces turn up. If you've lived near farmland, remote property, or work sites where certain areas were quietly off limits, if you were told not to ask questions, not to stay after dark, or not to go near something that didn't seem dangerous, you're not the only one. Those stories tend to surface here. If you want more accounts like these, built from records, witness statements, and patterns people overlooked, subscribe. New cases are added regularly. Some stand on their own, others connect in ways that only become clear over time. And if there's a place near you that everyone avoids without explanation, a structure no one uses, or a rule that never made sense, you might want to keep listening.